Hey everyone, it's Leanie. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have another video coming to us from The Painful Explainer, and this is the worst library deaths ever. So, you guys do not know this, but I went to school to be a librarian. I used to work in a library. So, I am so interested to see this video. Make sure to go show Painful Explainer some love, and let's get right into it.
The accidental decapitation by elevator.
Oh, whoa,
On
okay,
August 16th,
we're starting there.
2003, a 35-year-old surgical resident arrived for his shift at Christus St. Joseph Hospital in Houston, Texas.
Okay.
The 35-year-old surgical resident had spent years training to save lives. That morning, he walked the familiar corridors of the hospital, passing near the medical library where he often studied between surgeries.
That is cool. I did not know they would have a medical library in a hospital.
At approximately 9:30 a.m., he approached the second-floor service elevator. He pressed the call button and waited as the door slid open. What he couldn't know was that the safety mechanism on this particular elevator had malfunctioned. The doors were closing and opening erratically, a problem that maintenance staff had been alerted to but hadn't yet fixed. As he stepped partially into the elevator, the doors suddenly began to close.
Oh my gosh.
They clamped around his shoulders and head. In that instant, before he could react, the elevator car began to rise. The mechanical system hadn't registered an obstruction. It continued its programmed journey upward. The force was immediate and deadly. His body was caught between the rising elevator car and the concrete floor above. His head and shoulders were pulled upward while his body remained outside the elevator. The mechanical pressure against his neck was enormous. What happened next was witnessed by a nurse who was already inside the elevator. The rising force partially severed his head from his body. The separation wasn't complete, but it was extensive enough that death was instantaneous. The nurse, trapped inside with his remains, frantically pressed the emergency button.
Just in
when
an
emergency
elevator,
responders arrived
someone
minutes
comes
later,
in,
they found a scene
and
so
their head gets
horrific
chopped
that
off,
several
and you're just in the
hospital
elevator
staff
with
had
their
to turn
head.
away. The elevator had to be manually lowered to retrieve what remained of the doctor's body. Blood had spread across both the inside of the elevator car and the second floor hallway. Investigators later determined that proper maintenance would have prevented the tragedy. The elevator's proximity sensor had failed, allowing it to move with its doors partially obstructed. The murder in the stacks.
Okay, let me talk back about my library days. When our elevators would go down, and they would go down very, very often, we would go and we would have these like seatbelt things that we would pull across the front of the freaking elevator, and it would say out of order. So even if the doors were to open, it would tell the people not to get in. Why did they do that there? That is insane.
On November 28,
a murder
1969,
in the stacks.
a 22-year-old graduate student walked into Pattee Library at Penn State University. She was working on a research paper due after Thanksgiving break. She wore a red dress that day, a detail that would later become tragically significant. It was approximately 4:30 p.m. when she entered the dimly lit stacks
to murder someone in a library where it's like all quiet
that Friday afternoon.
Always quiet.
Most students had gone home for the holiday. She made her way through row 51 of the English literature section, a narrow corridor of bookshelves that created a maze-like environment. Security cameras didn't exist in the stacks, and visibility between the rows was intentionally limited to maintain the library's academic atmosphere. At 4:45 p.m., witnesses heard a scream and the sound of books falling. It lasted only seconds.
So there was a scream.
"Somebody better help that girl," before disappearing. When students in nearby rows reached her, they found her slumped between the bookshelves. She was still standing, her back against the books, but something was wrong. Her red dress concealed the blood. Those who discovered her initially thought she had fainted. They lowered her to the ground and attempted to help. Only then did someone notice a small tear in her dress directly over her heart. The single knife wound was so precise that it had pierced her heart, causing massive internal bleeding but little external blood flow. The wound was small, just 1 inch wide and deep enough to penetrate her heart. The medical examiner later determined the weapon was likely a hunting knife with a single sharp edge. The stab was delivered with such precision that she had only moments of consciousness after the attack. By the time emergency services arrived at 5:01 p.m., she had died from internal hemorrhaging. The killer had vanished into the labyrinthine stacks, leaving behind no fingerprints, no weapon, and no apparent motive. Despite an extensive investigation involving the FBI, her murderer was never identified. The machete attack in the lobby. On January 20th, 2019, a 69-year-old library director arrived early at the Fort Myers Beach Public Library. The director had served the community for over 2 decades and was known for his punctuality. It was Sunday morning, just before 9 a.m., and he was preparing to open the doors for a weekend book sale. The sky was clear, the temperature mild, a perfect Florida winter morning. He approached the entrance with keys in hand. He had made this walk hundreds of times before. The library, a modern 2-story building with large windows, stood quiet before its scheduled opening. Regular patrons were already gathering outside, waiting for the doors to unlock. Some recognized him and waved as he approached. At 9:02 a.m., as he inserted his key into the front door lock, a man emerged from behind a nearby pillar. The assailant moved with deliberate speed toward the library director. In his hand was a machete with a 15-inch blade.
He's
Security
just running
cameras later
past
showed
people?
that the attack was not random. The man had been waiting specifically for the director to arrive. The first strike caught him in the lower torso.
Oh my gosh.
The blade penetrated his abdomen with such force that
Not
it caused
even
immediate
scared that there's a
internal
bunch of
damage.
other people
He
around.
collapsed against the glass doors, his keys still dangling from the lock. The attacker
Why would he
continued,
do
striking
that?
him multiple times while horrified patrons screamed and ran for cover. Within seconds, the library entrance was covered in blood. The
Oh
director
my
remained
goodness
conscious briefly,
gracious.
attempting to shield himself from the continuing blows. The machete struck his arms, chest, and neck. Each wound was deep, precise, and deliberately placed. Witnesses later described the attack as methodical rather than frenzied.
Why?
Emergency services were called immediately,
wasn't
but
random.
by the time
He sat
paramedics
there
arrived
waiting
6
for
minutes later,
him.
he had lost too much blood. Despite resuscitation attempts, he was pronounced dead at the scene at 9:21 a.m. The attacker remained at the scene, machete still in hand,
What?
making no attempt to flee. Police
The heck is
later
wrong with
identified
him?
the attacker as a homeless man who had been previously
Oh my
removed from the library by the
gosh.
director for sleeping in the building.
That
the volunteer's
happens-
fatal beating.
That,
On May 20-
1 second. That happens a lot because libraries are like public spaces and they're oftentimes like the only place that people can go and use a computer and the internet and printers for free. And so you deal with a lot of homeless people coming in, but that is tragic. That's sad.
24th, 2018, a 59-year-old volunteer librarian opened the Christian Science Reading Room in downtown Ottawa, Canada. The
Okay.
librarian arrived at 10 a.m. to prepare the small storefront library for visitors. She had been volunteering there for many years, finding purpose in the
She's
quiet space
volunteering.
filled with religious
Let's
text.
remember that.
The reading
She's not
room,
getting
nestled
paid for
between busy
this.
shops on Laurier Avenue West,
She's gonna
typically
pay
saw
with her
only
life.
a handful of visitors each day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed that the reading room remained quiet throughout the morning. No unusual activity was visible from the street. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a man entered the facility. Unlike most visitors, he didn't browse the collection. Instead, he approached the librarian directly at her desk near the back of the room. What
Okay.
happened next wasn't captured on any camera. The
What
reading
did
room
he
had
do?
no security system, no panic button, and no witnesses.
Oh
For nearly an
gosh.
hour, the man remained inside with her. At 1:40 p.m., he left the building alone, walking casually away from the scene. At 1:50 p.m., a fellow volunteer arrived to relieve her for the afternoon shift. She found the
Oh
reading
my
room
gosh.
unusually quiet. Calling out her name and receiving no answer, she
Psalm?
walked toward the back office area. There she
Oh
discovered the
my
librarian lying on the
goodness.
floor, unconscious and severely beaten. Her face was unrecognizable from the trauma, and blood pooled beneath her head.
Oh,
Medical
no.
examiners later determined that she had been beaten repeatedly with fists, and possibly a
Beaten?
blunt object. Her skull had sustained multiple fractures. The attack had focused primarily
She's
on her
a
head and
grandma.
face. Her injuries indicated she had tried to defend herself, with defensive wounds on her arms and hands. Paramedics rushed her to the Ottawa Hospital's
She
trauma
tried to
center.
fight him
Despite
off.
emergency surgery to relieve pressure on her brain, the damage was irreparable. For
That
15
is
hours, she
so
clung to life, her
sad.
vital signs gradually weakening. Her husband and family gathered at her bedside as doctors explained there was no hope for recovery. At 5:45 a.m. on May 25th, she was pronounced dead from blunt force trauma to the head.
How
The deadly
sad.
assault
I hope
with
they
a van.
found that guy.
On November 9th, 2020, a 52-year-old librarian was at home in Polk City, Florida. They had spent the
Okay.
morning at the local library where she worked as the children's events coordinator. She was known throughout the community for her storytelling sessions and her passion for bringing books to life for young readers. That
Aw.
afternoon, she found herself involved in a
That sounds
confrontation
fun.
that began over her son's broken relationship. At
Aw.
approximately 2:30 p.m., 4 teenagers arrived at her home in a van. Among them was the ex-boyfriend of her son. The relationship had ended badly
What?
weeks earlier, with accusations of stolen property. The teens had come to retrieve items they claimed belonged to them, but the situation quickly escalated. Security cameras from neighboring homes captured what happened next. She emerged from her house and began taking photos of the teenagers in their vehicle with her phone.
Saying, like,
She stood in
"Get
her front
off my
yard,
property."
documenting their presence. This act visibly agitated the group. Witnesses would later describe hearing shouting from both sides. As she continued taking photos, the
She's
driver
over here
of the van
like, get
suddenly
out. Oh
accelerated.
my gosh,
The
they
vehicle,
ran her
later
over?
identified as a church van that had been borrowed without permission, lurched forward directly toward where she stood. There was no attempt to swerve or brake. The van struck her at an estimated 30 miles per hour. Impact threw her several feet backward. Her
You
head
guys
struck
came
the
to get
pavement with
so-called
crushing force.
stolen
The
items
van
back
briefly
and left
stopped, then accelerated again, this
murdering
time
someone.
driving over her body as it fled the
What
scene.
the
Neighbors
heck
rushed to
is
help,
wrong with
finding her
people?
unconscious with multiple crush injuries to her chest
Oh,
and severe head trauma.
no.
Paramedics arrived within minutes and found her still breathing, but barely. She was airlifted to Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center, where doctors immediately recognized the severity of her injuries. CT scans revealed extensive internal bleeding and devastating brain trauma. For 3 weeks, she remained on life support.
3 weeks?
Despite multiple surgeries and the best efforts of the medical team, her condition continued to deteriorate. On November 30th, 2020, she never regained consciousness after the attack. The death of the Mughal emperor. On January 24th, 1556, an emperor was ascending the stone staircase of his personal library, the Sher Mandal, at Puranachila in Delhi. The 47-year-old Mughal ruler had reclaimed his throne just 6 months earlier after 15 years in exile. The library was his sanctuary, a 2-story octagonal tower where he pursued his passion for astronomy and literature. That evening, he carried several manuscripts and an astrolabe, planning to observe the stars from the rooftop. The staircase of the Sher Mandal was notoriously steep and narrow, designed more for aesthetic appeal than safety. Each step was made of polished sandstone, worn smooth by daily use. The stairs wound upward in a tight spiral, with minimal lighting from small windows set high in the walls. He had climbed these stairs countless times before.
There's a lot of information about the stairs.
Design. At approximately 7 p.m., as he neared the top of the staircase, the muezzin's call to evening prayer began. Court chroniclers later recorded that the emperor, a devout Muslim, attempted to kneel in response while still on the stairs. As he began to lower himself, his foot caught in the flowing robe he wore. For a brief moment, he struggled to regain his balance. The fall was sudden and violent. He tumbled backward
rolled
down
all the way
entire
back
length
down?
of the stone staircase.
Shoot.
His body struck each step with increasing
his
momentum.
neck.
The manuscripts scattered around him as he fell. Courtiers at the bottom of the stairs heard the commotion but could not reach him in time to break his descent. When attendants reached the emperor, they found him unconscious at the base of the stairs. Blood pooled beneath his head where it had struck the stone floor. His right arm and several ribs were visibly broken. Despite the obvious severity of his injuries, he was still breathing, though each breath came as a labored gasp. Court physicians were summoned immediately. They applied poultices to his wounds and attempted to stem the bleeding, but they lacked the knowledge to treat the internal injuries. The emperor never regained consciousness. For 3 days, he lay in his royal chambers as his condition steadily worsened. On January 27th, 1556, the Mughal emperor died from what modern doctors would recognize as traumatic brain injury and internal hemorrhaging. The death by drunk driver.
Maybe in another time he would have been able to be saved.
A 37-year-old youth librarian finished her shift at the Belmont Library in Portland, Oregon. She'd spent the day organizing a summer reading program for local children. Colleagues described her as passionate about her work, often staying late to ensure everything was perfect for the next day's activities. As a mother of 2 young boys, she had a natural ability to connect with the children who visited the library. At 6:45 p.m., she exited the library staff entrance. The summer evening was still bright, with temperatures hovering around 80 degrees. She walked toward the bus stop located just 15 feet from the library's property line. According to her routine, she would catch the 6:52 p.m. bus home to the apartment where her sons were waiting with a babysitter. She stood at the bus stop alongside 2 other commuters. Security footage from the library's exterior cameras showed her checking her phone, likely texting her babysitter about her imminent arrival home. At precisely 6:49 p.m., a black sedan appeared on the road, moving at a speed later calculated to be approximately 68 miles per hour in a 20-mile zone. The vehicle was weaving erratically between lanes. As it approached the bus stop, the driver lost control. Without warning or any attempt to brake, the sedan left the road and barreled directly toward the waiting passengers. The other commuters managed to leap clear in the final seconds. The librarian, still looking at her phone, had no time to react. The impact was violent. The sedan struck her at full speed, crushing her against the metal bus stop shelter. The force was so severe that the structure itself collapsed. She was thrown nearly 20 feet, landing on the library's lawn. The car continued another 40 feet before crashing into a utility pole. First responders arrived within 3 minutes. They found her unresponsive with multiple traumatic injuries. Her spine was severed at the 3rd vertebra, her pelvis shattered, and her internal organs had suffered massive trauma. Despite immediate resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene at 7:11 p.m. The driver, a 41-year-old man, had a blood alcohol level later measured at 0.21%, nearly 3 times the legal limit. The Petworth Computer Room killing. On March 2nd, 2023, a 45-year-old regular patron sat at a computer terminal in the Petworth Neighborhood Library in Washington, D.C. The patron had been using the library services for over a year, often spending hours researching job opportunities. That Thursday afternoon, the computer room was moderately busy, with about a dozen people people quietly working at the long wooden tables lined with monitors.
Okay.
At approximately 4:15 p.m., a man entered the computer area and approached the patron. The person was later identified to be a 33-year-old homeless man who frequently used the library as shelter during operating hours.
Yeah.
Security footage showed the two men had a brief verbal exchange. According to witnesses, it concerned a previous dispute over money. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds before the homeless man suddenly reached into his jacket. Without warning, he produced a large butcher's knife with an 8-inch blade. Before anyone could react, the homeless man lunged forward, bringing the knife down with tremendous force toward the patron's upper body. The first strike penetrated the patron's chest, piercing his left lung. Blood immediately sprayed onto the computer monitor in front of him. He attempted to stand but collapsed almost instantly. The homeless man continued his attack, stabbing him 3 more times in rapid succession.
Someone grab that man and his knife?
Targeting the victim's torso. Patrons scattered in panic, many rushing for the exits while others froze in shock. The patron, still conscious but rapidly weakening, fell sideways from his chair. He collapsed directly into the lap of a 62-year-old bystander seated at the adjacent computer station.
Oh my
They
gosh.
later described feeling the warmth of the patron's blood soaking through their own clothing as the victim gasped for air.
How
2 security guards and a librarian
traumatizing.
responded to the commotion, arriving within seconds. 3 male patrons had already tackled the homeless man to the ground, disarming him. The knife skidded across the floor, coming to rest under a nearby table, its blade coated in blood. Emergency services arrived within 4 minutes,
Over
but
what?
the patron's
Couple
condition
funky
deteriorated
dollars?
rapidly. The knife had severed major blood vessels, causing catastrophic internal bleeding. Despite immediate medical intervention, the patron was pronounced dead at 4:37 p.m., just 22 minutes after the attack began.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, those were all horrifying. From the elevator, the first one, that was insane, to just like random attacks. I don't understand why people are so violent. Make sure to go show the Painful Explainer some love, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye.